Okay, so welcome. I'm calling this Sun, Moon, and Stars Photography. So a little bit about basics in this. If you are doing low light or night photography, you definitely want to be in manual mode or bulb mode. If your camera has the B or the bulb mode, that allows you to keep the shutter open for a much longer period of time. Also, if you have the option, you should be shooting in RAW so that you can then process it later. Your aperture is going to be as wide open as possible to let that light in. Remember, the aperture is in the lens and it's lens dependent. And a lot of photography, you have to use the slower shutter speed to let the light in. And you think the ISO trade-offs is each camera, how far can you go before your camera is too pixely to have a quality image that you would enjoy? You need to steady your camera. Tripods are really a must with anything that's a heavier camera. Even with your camera phones, if you have a tripod, you want to use that. You can use a timer or a cable release. And the reason for that is that because you're setting up, when you do a cable release, that allows you to activate the camera without shaking it. And it's really important to research the weather in the sky. And there's a number of different apps. Photo Pills and Star Walk 2 will tell you what the sky conditions are. They'll also tell you where you need to be in order to get the best angle of the light. So for sunsets, and this sunset is taken up in Shenandoah National Park. For composition, you want the sun to be in an area that looks pleasing. A lot of times in the middle is not as pleasing as if you do it in one of those rule of thirds where they intersect. The other thing about sunset is if you just take a picture of the sun and you don't have anything in the foreground, it's not as interesting. So in this picture, there's a little bit of the wall, a little bit of mountains, a little bit of vegetation. And the reason I could get all these different layers in is that this is taken as a composite. It's taken as 5 different pictures, one that focused on the vegetation in terms of the light and all the way to the mountains. The same composition rules follow of using leading lines to draw the viewer into it. With sunsets, it's important to level your horizon. One of my cameras, I do have a level in it, or if I set up on a tripod, I look at my level first to make sure that I'm nice and square with the horizon. The other thing with sunsets is patterns and textures can add interest. And during the sunset, you may want to walk around a little bit and get different viewpoints. Go low, go high, change where you are. I notice a lot of time when I'm up on Skyline Drive, people are waiting for the sunset and they pick a location and they probably take 50 pictures from that exact same location. And walk around, see what you're looking at. They don't always have to be horizontal, like this one's vertical. So play with it to make it interesting. And for sunsets, we always hope for a little bit of good clouds. And by good clouds, I mean clouds that will light up with the sunset so they're not too heavy to block. And it's hard to predict. There have been many days where I've looked at the clouds and said it's going to be an awesome sunset, and then it just grays out. But clouds make for a really interesting sky. And the other thing that I don't have in here, and we've talked about this before in composition, is you have to decide how much of the sky versus the foreground you want in your picture. And usually a general advice to follow is rather than do 50-50, even doing a third. So in this case, the sky is about a third of it and 2/3 is the foreground. Again, settings for the sun and the picture taken on the left. This is actually full disclosure, this is a sunrise in Nebraska. The sun rises in Nebraska in a really beautiful way. And this, getting to this time of year is when the sandhill cranes start to migrate through Nebraska, and they have beautiful sunrises. And so manual focus. Sometimes your focus mode has to be manual because you don't have enough light to be able to focus. Shutter speed, 1/3 of a second or longer. Aperture, f/16 or greater. And to get that bursting lens look, you want to be f/16, 18, 22, depending on your lens. Low ISO. And a lot of times for doing landscape or sunsets, wide angle lens, 18 to 24 mm. And a lot of times with sunsets and sunrises, I'm a little bit underexposed to be able to highlight the sun and get the sun in here. The other thing, again, in full disclosure, is that the sun will be a white ball in the sky. And what I did with this is I put a yellow layer in Photoshop to get the sun to be sun colored. Even with doing it, with the birds flying, you can't do multiple exposures and combine them unless you take one with no birds in it and then you add the birds later. But here I had to expose for the sun, and it ended up being a big blinky white area. So the other thing people like to do with evening is that streaky lights type of thing. This is a Getty image. It's not one of my images. And to get this sort of streaky lights and city lights with cars moving, your shutter speed starts at about 15 seconds to allow enough time for the vehicles to move through the frame. Your aperture can be mid-range, about f/8, a low ISO, and you have a long shutter speed. And then you adjust from there depending on how much ambient light is in there. And you can do these sort of streaky light type of photography with any camera, and people have done them with their smartphones too. It would be fun to try to play with that. If you have a smartphone, again, I would go off their night mode and set that exposure, and we can talk about that in a minute. But again, if you're moving, these lights will not be this nice snaky look. They'll be jagged and up and down. So you have to secure your camera when you're doing this. Moon photography, and this is a picture that I took with my 600mm lens. And I meant to look up and I didn't when our next supermoons are, but moon photography, I like to take pictures of the moon. I think it's really fun. And again, when the moon is really big and on the horizon, almost any camera can do moon photography. So to do moon photography, one of the things is that you need to understand the different phases of the moon. And so a little bit of moon information, and we sort of all know this, but I want to talk about the implications for photography. When you have a new moon, there's no sunlight on the side of the moon that's facing us. So it's sort of a very small crescent, and it's very dark. And the full moon is the opposite. We have full sunlight facing the moon. A waxing one, the light is growing. The waning one, light is less. And the waxing and waning crescents, they have the same shape, but they appear on opposite sides of the moon. And the amount of light coming from the moon will be very different. So the implications for photography, a couple of different things. You tend to capture more detail of the moon in the waxing phases than when even the moon is full. And the reason is because when the moon is really, really full, you're getting so much light coming from it that it's more difficult to get the details. And so as we think about moon photography and you look at these two pictures, I really like to photograph the moon during the waxing phase because I think it's more mysterious. You get more of the look of the craters. It's easier to be able to get your exposure levels. And I think it's more mysterious. So it's important to think, well, yes, the full moon is always really pretty, but don't ignore when you've got a really pretty night for a waxing phase of the moon, because it's great opportunities for photography. The other reason that we look at that is that the amount of light, if you're trying to do stars, it's far better to do stars when there's very little moon, when there's a new moon. So the moon when it's low light, or this is a picture from one of the overlooks on Shenandoah National Park, and the moon was actually right there, and it was a really, really pretty sunset. And so sometimes as the moon is rising and there's a little bit of clouds and there's sunset, this one overlook, there's a tree I really like there. It frames the moon really pretty. And you can be there, bring your dinner, you can watch sunset to the mountains, and then the moon will rise on the other side. It's really pretty. So with moon, when you have low light, but there's still enough light, your shutter speed is going to be a slow shutter speed, 1/125 to start. Set your aperture at f8 or f11. That's if you want to get the detail of the moon and also the foreground. But again, it will depend on the lens and it will depend on what you're trying to do. And your ISO as low as possible to be able to keep noise from coming out. So on your iPhones, you can take moon photography. I recommend that the moon has to be rather large to do this. If it's a really small speck in the sky, it's not going to be very attractive. But if we get a moonrise or supermoon, it's really, you can do it. You're limited, but you can do it. So what you do with your iPhone is you focus as best you can on the moon. You focus on that area, you touch the screen. And when the yellow box, you need to slide it up and down. And what you're going to probably do is underexpose the moon. And if you have a more advanced iPhone, I take it off the night mode and I adjust it myself. With the iPhone though, there's an app you can get to do night skies, which is called Nightcap Pro. And it's only $2.99, and it allows you to do a number of different things. You can do, you can set a timer, you can do a burst mode, you can do intervals, which allows you to do star photography or star trails. You can change your exposure, and you can see in the app, and I haven't done it myself, but you can pick even light trails, and on this bird taking off, that's in the light trail mode. It just does it for that. And so I think if you do have an iPhone and you want to try to do some of this night photography, I definitely would recommend investing the $2.99 and trying to work with this app. It allows you to adjust your white balance, your ISO, you can geotag where you are, and do different types of exposures. So I definitely think it's worth trying that, and particularly with intervals, and I'll talk about intervals in a bit. That's the only easy way to do intervals on the iPhone. The Androids have a little bit more options, and that app is not available for the Androids. The Androids have a built-in Pro mode. It also has a built-in night mode, depending on which software adjustment you have. And you can in the Pro mode on your Android, you can set your ISO there is no aperture control on the Android Pro mode, but your lenses, most of the Android lenses are like 2.2 for the f-stop anyhow. So you're wide open anyhow with doing it. But again, with your Android and your iPhone, it is important because you're going to be shooting with long exposure to secure the phone. So last night, I have an Android that I've been playing with, and it's the new one. So it's got like the super 5 crazy cameras in it and everything. And I said, well, can you do night photography with an Android? And I went outside on my deck and I didn't secure it or anything. I just shot it in their night mode. And this is if I had put it on my tripod, I think it would have been, the moon would have been exposed a little bit better. But for those of you that know anything about the night skies, I'm seeing Cassiopeia's, or I think it's Cassiopeia's belt. No, I think it's Cassiopeia's shoot. But you can see the stars are pretty darn clear. And I think in the clouds, there's maybe an airplane that's flying through. So if I'm going to play with this Android phone a little bit more on a tripod tonight to see what I can get. But that's pretty good given the technology of those phones. So it's possible to do it if you are wanting to do some night photography. Again, with the iPhone, I would download the app. With the Android, depending on the model of Android you have, and if you've done a recent update of the software, definitely look in your camera. There is a pro mode, there's a night mode. There's a lot of adjustments that you can make in your Android devices. And I'm going to be doing an Android phone class next week for those of you that have Androids. So the other thing I like to do when I do moon photography is composites. And this heron could be a little bit cleaner in the way I cut it out, but I did it really quickly. And one night, or one day actually, don't forget to take pictures of the moon when it's out at earlier in the day before it gets dark. And that's why it's good to have an app or look up when is the moon rising and where is it going to rise. Because this moon picture was taken when the moon is that bluish color during the day when it's white blue. And I just took it with my 1:500 lens and just took a picture and cropped it. It was coming up. And at the same time, on the same day, a heron was flying. And I said, well, I'm going to do the heron in silhouette, and then I'm going to put them together as a composite. And the reason why you know it's a composite is that there's no way that we could get the clarity of the moon in terms of focus and the clarity of the bird. If the bird was near the moon that far away, it would have been a speck. So the moon was much close. The moon was far away. The heron was flying closer to me. Again, just turn the heron into a silhouette. And then in Photoshop, it's 2 layers together. I just cut the heron out. And so it's fun to do composites with the moon. And a lot of times when you see night photography and then you see silhouettes in the foreground, you should know that it's probably 2 pictures that the photographer put together. Not always, but a lot of times. So a couple of other composites. The sandhill cranes were flying and the full moon was beautiful in Nebraska. And again, did the same thing. I just that was what I was seeing, but the limits of our equipment, and I couldn't ever get the clarity of the cranes because again, they're much closer to me, and the moon at the same time. But this is when you take photography and you change it to artwork. So here's that overlook with my favorite tree in Shenandoah National Park. And this is the night that the supermoon was coming up a couple of years ago. And the earlier picture, the moon was sort of in that that same area. It was closer to the tree. But when the supermoon came up, it was nowhere near the tree. But I decided I really wanted the tree to be holding the moon. So again, it's a composite. It's heavily changed in post-processing by adding a lot of color to it. Definitely a piece of art, not a realistic, but you can have real fun with moon photography doing combinations. So the night skies, and around here, our night skies, when we don't have moon and you get away from any of the ambient light, we've got great stars and at times the Milky Ways. So the setting for night photography, again, shutter speed, 15, and this is a starting point, it's 15 seconds. If you go a longer exposure, what will happen is that we're moving and the stars are moving, and what you get is streaky star trails, which you may want, but if you're doing star trails, you need to photograph for star trails or else they'll just look blurry. Your aperture is wide open as you can get. Again, different lenses have different apertures. 2.8, I have a camera that's lower than 2.8. It's more wide open. And again, your ISO is going to be camera dependent, but you want to go as low as you can go on your setting for stars. So the big trick, and Megan will talk more about this when we talk about Aurora photography, is how do you focus on a night, in the night skies? And so one thing that you want to do, and particularly it's getting a little bit different if you've got a mirrorless camera, but on a mirrored camera, you definitely want to be focusing in live view, looking at your panel in the back of the camera. You need to use manual focus because you do night skies when it's the darkest possible. You want to do your night skies when it's a new moon, when you want to get away from ambient light and get, again, as dark as possible. So how do you focus? You definitely focus manually, but here's the trick to doing night skies, is that your lens may have an infinity mark on it, so you can turn your lens to focus to infinity, but the lenses tend to be very imprecise. You can bring a flashlight and shine it on an object that's far in the distance and focus your camera. Or you could do that focusing of your camera during the daytime and tape your lens very gently with gaffer's tape or a tape that won't hurt your lens. Because you will not have enough light if you're doing this right to be able to find what a good focus is for your lens on infinity. And once you have your camera set and focused on infinity, it doesn't matter where you're going to point it. You want it taped down and you don't want to touch it for the rest of the night. And so all the challenge of night photography is, at least in my experience here, and I would have to say I haven't done auroras, but I think it is the setup ahead of time. It's knowing where the light is going to be, where the Milky Way, and again, those apps will tell you exactly if you're standing, what stars will be there, what light will be there, where you want to focus. So a lot of it is finding the right location, having your camera secured, doing your focus ahead of time, being able to be out. A lot of times the best skies are going to also be in the cold weather, because if you think about here, and definitely in Alaska, there's no night, but summer is much more difficult for doing night photography because we don't have as much darkness. So you have to wait later and later in the day, and you tend to have more humidity, and like the the cold is your friend in terms of clarity for the night skies. So another part of night photography is is having the right gear for yourself, setting your camera up, having patience, having other people around you not shine lights, and a lot of trial and error. And sometimes now with your cameras, if your camera will communicate with an app on your cell phone, you can be also doing your settings from your cell phone, long as you don't ruin the light for other people. So night sky photography is, again, you like to take a picture of the stars in this tree. It took me a lot of times walking around saying, what do I have? And sometimes you don't know until the photo appears what exactly you have. And so the more familiar you are with the location, the better. But a lot of it's preparation. So if you do want streaky stars, and this will be something, again, that if you're using a smartphone instead of a camera, your shutter speed's 30 seconds or longer. And you also set your shutter speeds to be open. You can do 30 seconds and you'll get streaks. But if you really want to get the ones that look like they're almost rotating around, you can also put your camera out, set it on bulb, press it, it will stay open, carefully walk away, come back in 15 or 30 minutes, and then close your shutter. That's how long some of the really dramatic night scenes are. Again, wide open as far as you can, ISO 400 to 800, and again, a wide angle lens. And if you can do it as wide open as wide as you can. So before we have Megan talk about Aurora Photography, and this one I borrowed from Megan's site. It's really, really beautiful. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and see if there's any questions. Any questions about that portion of the presentation?
I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some night photography that actually looks like it's done during the day. So I'm just presuming that they either had a higher ISO or because you think about the shutter speed without getting it streaky. So what's the trick with that?
Yeah, you're right. It's the quality of the camera. My guess is that there was a lot of ambient light. A lot of times that photography is done in urban areas that are pretty well lit. So there's dark and light together. And not a lot moving, because if things are moving, it's still high ISO. If there's cars and things, then there's light. It's the triangle again. You either have to have high ISO or high shutter speed if you've got movement. If there's no movement, and if you look at a lot of the night photography, a lot of times it's in empty urban areas. It's pretty, but there's nothing moving. There's no wind. So it's all that trade-off of what is lighting the area. Okay. And you can do, the other thing you can do is light painting. And light painting can be done at night, and then somebody is holding a flashlight on the one area that you want to illuminate. And it works really well. And you can do light painting even with some of the night star photography. So you've got people focused on the sky, and then there's a bush or a tree or something, and someone's just lighting that with a regular flashlight or a very strong flashlight. And a lot of the really pretty paintings in like the canyons, they're now outlawing people coming in and doing light painting, even though it doesn't hurt it. It sounds like you're actually paintbrush, but so many people were doing it, it was annoying other people who wanted to do night photography. But a lot of the really, really pretty canyons that you can see that it's a night sky, but just the rock structure itself is lit. Someone is holding a very high luminant flashlight, lighting up that object. So does that answer it? Megan, would you add anything to that?
That's a pretty good analysis, I'd say, for most of them. The only thing, and I'll show you in a lot of my photos, is the moon. If it's a full moon, it will add a lot of ambient light. And it's personal preference as to whether you like it or not, and in different circumstances. So I'll show you some variances in that in my photos, but the moon will add a ton of light as well and give you a lot more to work with in terms of shutter speed without getting star trails. So, and then sometimes the star trails are there, but because it's a full moon, they're harder to see, and you could have it be a couple hours long and it would look like broad daylight and it's so bright. I have some that I've done like that were like 3-4 hour long exposures and you could barely see the stars because it was so bright. So if you're not paying attention, they're there sometimes too as well. But
thanks.
And then if you have moon and icy bright snow like we have now, last night was pretty bright. It's like a giant reflector on the bottom, and people do use lights and reflectors too, big reflectors. But yeah, and that's why a lot of times with moon photography, that's why I like the phases where it's starting to build up instead of full, because if you've got one of those big super moons, if you look at all the people who do super moons, there's no detail in the moon, because you've got so much darn light. You're almost like having to take such a fast shutter speed, and you almost need a neutral density filter to knock out some of the light, because it's like a giant big headlights coming at you. Other questions? Everybody excited? Megan, I made you a co-host. So now the challenge is, do you know how to share your screen?
I think.
Okay.
Let's see if it works. Find out. All right. What are you seeing?
Cool.
Is that working?
Yep.
Cool. All right. As long as we're in business. So, I'm actually going to start with a couple of my photo duds, just because I want you guys to see those first before everything else. It's always good to end on the high notes, right? But you were talking the focus. It really is the single most challenging thing with night photography, especially with stars, because you can tell it's just a tiniest bit off and it'll just be done for, so you can zoom in and you can tell these stars aren't quite there. And the problem, what happened on this one is I had my lens taped and it got really, really cold and I wasn't using a good tape and the tape froze up and it wasn't working anymore. And the adrenaline gets going and you're not paying attention, and that's the end of it. And you bump it and you don't even notice. So one thing that I recommend that I've made a habit of doing is actually periodically zooming way in on a photo, just to double check every now and then that I haven't accidentally bumped it. Because like from a distance, this photo doesn't look too bad until you zoom it in, and then you can notice that it's not quite there. Same thing with these. And I was so bummed when I missed these, because this pink does not happen very often and it's really, really hard to photograph. But you'll see those stars aren't quite there, and I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so makes it a little bit hard. But single hardest thing is getting that focus perfect. Same thing here. In this case, actually, these photos here, what actually happened is this was last January, and it was -55 that night. And my camera lens froze up, and I had zoomed in just a little bit on one, because it's I use a Tamron 15-30 lens on my Canon, and it was so cold, it froze up and it lost its focus because it was frozen up. And because it was so cold, I couldn't get it back. So it kind of ruined my shooting for that night, which was kind of a bummer. Same thing there. It's even worse, actually. Another thing that's really, really common, you'll tell this one, is totally out of focus, except a little point right up here is not so bad. It's not actually fog in the air, that is fog from the lens. So when you're going in and out, so especially up in Alaska, it's so cold, you have to go in and warm up periodically. And if you go in, you take your camera with you, you gotta cover it first. So make sure and have some sort of a bag that you can cover that whole camera up to prevent the lens from fogging up when you take it in where it's warm. Because otherwise you're going to bring it back out and these are the photos you're going to get, which is a bummer. And it takes quite a while for that lens to clear up again, usually about 20-30 minutes. So you could lose a lot of shooting time in that amount of time, especially with Aurora photography. That might be the only good time of the night and you missed it because it was fogged. So always have something with you to keep it from fogging, cover up that lens. Another thing similar to this that I've had happen too, when it's really, really cold, which is typical for Alaska and Aurora photography, is when you're looking through the lens and you're breathing, depending on the size of your camera and the size of your lens, that moisture from your breath will actually stick to the camera. Typically, it's just in the back, but over time, I've had it actually build up on the lens. So I typically recommend using a lens hood, even though it's not daylight and no typical reason for needing that hood. But if you've got a hood on, it'll help protect the lens from your breath as well. So that's also useful because it's hard to notice when you're taking the photos. And since we talked about moon photography, I thought I'd bring a couple of these. This was kind of my first attempt at a lunar eclipse. And this particular night was pretty neat. The second time I got much better on my focus. It is hard to focus. This was with a 1:400 and a 1:4 teleconverter on it. So about 540 millimeters. And just under a second was my exposure on that one, I think. What was it, like f8 maybe? But that same night, we actually had Aurora at the same time as the lunar eclipse was going on. This one is a composite though, because you can't really photograph both of those things at the same time because you can't expose for both. So I got the exposure for the moon and then also combined it with the Aurora from that night. So that was pretty cool. I was pretty excited. That year had been really cloudy too, so I did not actually expect to see Aurora. Actually, I wasn't even sure I was going to see the eclipse because there had been so much cloudy weather, but we got really lucky. And feel free, guys, if anybody has a question or something, you can chip in.
I wonder, do you use a tripod ever, or are you holding the camera all the time?
Always with a tripod on these. And actually, that's a good thing to mention too, is not all tripods are created equal when you're shooting in the cold. My primary tripod is a ball head tripod, which works great in many circumstances, but I've actually found it is a bit of a weakness for really cold temperatures because the lubricant in the ball will actually freeze up and then you can't tighten it down properly and it will end up being loose and falling all the time on you. And it gets rather obnoxious. So as a forethought, if you have a non-ball head tripod, if it's going to be really cold, it is worth it because it will freeze up. But you have to have the tripod. All of these exposures, typically for an Aurora photo, kind of my baseline is going to be 6 to 10 seconds is going to be my baseline for shutter speed. Usually I'll start at 1600 ISO and then wide open. I don't shoot anything that's more than a 2.8. So you got to have at least the 2.8 or wider, I think. Otherwise your shutter speeds are going to be really long and it's hard to avoid those star trails. But a lot of people, this is probably one of the most common questions that I get in photographing Aurora and even just seeing the Aurora is about the full moon. We've had people when I was working that would cancel their entire trip because they found out it was a full moon. And this is actually the full moon rising through the trees and the Aurora. So obviously that is not a big problem. And when there's snow on the ground, like we were talking about earlier, I actually like it better. I think it's beautiful. So we'll see a few of the full moon aurora photos. So all of these are near or full moon shots. And when you get the snow, it's amazing because you have the full foreground instead of just silhouettes to work with, which I love. Same thing there, shooting straight into a full moon with the aurora behind it. And same thing there. That was actually the same night, I believe. And moving around, that is such a key with this. So many people, I see it all the time with Aurora Photography. They set it up and they take the same photo from the same angle all night long. And at the end of the day, you're only going to really get one shot out of that because it's the same composition. But move your feet, keep moving around, and you can get dozens of different photos from the same show. But with the snow, I love it. It does. It looks like broad daylight till you look and see that there's actually a couple of stars there, which is pretty neat. And then this is the other version. So when you get a full moon, when there's no snow. So this was early on in the season, probably mid-September, and you don't have the snow. So you still can see the foreground, but it ends up kind of being a version of brown. So when there's no snow, it's not my favorite with a full moon. But it affects the aurora very, very little. It's more about your personal preference on how it affects the foreground as to whether or not you want to be there during a full moon. But most photographers that I talk to, this is what you want to see. You want to see the whole composition, the snow on the trees, and it's just beautiful. And there's not much aurora in that one. That one's a really faint aurora. It was more about the moon in that if you stop down your aperture, you can get that burst, that starburst effect. You usually shoot f11 or so to get that, but it works pretty good with a full moon because it's bright enough. You can still not have to have your shutter speed super, super long. But there's a couple of those. That's the other fun thing about full moons. If there's no aurora, you can do other things to play with it.
So how many different trails do you go on to find these different positions? Are you like going for a half hour hiking, or are you doing it right outside the house or door?
In this case, most of these photos were taken while I was working. So most of them are all on the same. It's a 10-acre property, but there's really only about 5 acres of it that's open for photographing from. So it's all on one big kind of field. It was actually originally cleared out for being a dog yard for dogs, but now it's just an open field and we use it for photographing from. So you get tons of different angles, even in a small space. Nice thing about doing this, and if you do come, at least one night, I highly recommend doing a guided tour because it is really hard to know what you're looking for and where to look and how to set up your camera. It's so helpful to get your camera set up ahead of time. Preparation really is 100% preparation. And then the rest is just luck, really. But if you can have your camera set up and go out and practice and get comfortable with using it in the dark, in the cold, and all of that, then you can, and then have a guide that can help you know what you're looking for, help you get your camera set up. And then once you've seen the aurora and you've got a little bit under your belt, makes it a lot easier. Like this aurora, it's so faint. You would never have seen it if you didn't know it was there, if you didn't know what you were looking for. Because unfortunately, one of the problems with the aurora is that our eyes are fairly limited in what we can see in the dark. So you've got rods and cones and in our eyes, and the rods are night vision, and they're only black and white. They can't actually see color. And then the cones can see color, but that's a daylight vision only. So until the aurora is bright enough to use our daylight vision, we can't really perceive the color. So a lot of times people miss it just because they don't realize that's what they're looking for because it's not green in color to their eyes. But you take a picture, it will always be green. The camera will always tell you the real color. Some more full moon fun there, but the camera always tells the truth on that aspect, at least. So that's nice. So if when in doubt, take a picture and then you'll know what you're looking at. But here's another one, not a full moon, probably like a half moon, but still get a lot of really neat stuff going on.
Would you ever focus on the aurora?
Well, I always focus on the stars, and the aurora is right there with the stars because the aurora at the closest is 50 to 60 miles above the Earth's surface. And typically these green auroras are more like 100 to 200 miles above the Earth's surface. So if the stars are in focus, so is the aurora. What happens though is because they're longer exposures, and I'll show this to you in just a little bit, there's more or less detail in the movement of the aurora. So sometimes like these, it was kind of just a slow misty aurora anyway, so it wasn't moving super fast. But let's see, come back here. Doesn't want to let me move on. There we go, all back. So there's not necessarily a whole lot of detail, but typically even the trees, if you're focused on the stars, if they're far away, even your trees are going to be pretty much in focus. Even that guy pretty much is. All the stars are pinpoints. But so you'll want to do, you know, the infinity focus. Usually when I'm focusing, I start with infinity focus on my lens, and then I kind of Kentucky windage it. So I'll use either the live view on the LCD, or I will just take a couple of photos and then zoom in and just kind of adjust it until it's perfect. And then yes, tape it down, use that gaffer's tape. I cannot stress that enough, because you will inevitably end up bumping it by accident. No matter how careful you are, you will bump it. So that tape is of utmost importance, in my opinion. But and then some of these I'll kind of zip through a little quicker. So this actually, I kept this image. I haven't edited this one at all. This one was just one that I pulled because as I was looking through the images, I recognized it looked a lot like another photo I had taken right there. Same, almost the same composition, completely different night. They were about a year apart, but this one had a moon and snow, and this one had none, and very similar aurora. So it gives you kind of an idea of how things change. When you don't have a moon, the aurora tends to be a little bit more dramatic. So some people like the drama of it. I like the beauty of the whole scene and the serenity of it. So I tend to lean more toward full moon snow shots because I love having that whole landscape composition. But some people are really into the drama of the aurora, which is totally understandable. In this case, usually by about March, the Milky Way will start interacting with the northern horizon where the aurora is. You can actually see that Milky Way. We don't get the bright galactic center here, the part you're used to seeing in photos, but you can still make it out crossing the aurora band there. So that's kind of cool, and that's usually in March when you start seeing that happening. The rest of the year, it's almost straight overhead, so you rarely get that. Reflections are really cool. This is a river that doesn't always freeze because it's flowing. It usually does toward the end of the year, but it'll stay open through November or so. If you're interested in reflection shots, that's one to come, you know, earlier on in the season before things freeze. More super dark skies. So you get lots and lots of stars, super contrast, more dramatic auroras. Trying to see, I think I've got a few in here. See, some of these you'll start seeing have, like, here we go. You'll see a lot more detail in the aurora. This one was one that was moving really, really fast. And they tend to be a lot brighter when they're that fast too. So this one, this is what I was seeing with the naked eye. That was bright enough. I was seeing every bit of that color. But because it's so much brighter, you could bring that shutter speed down. So I was shooting, this was probably about 3 seconds. And the more active the aurora is, the more movement there is, the faster you want that shutter speed to be. So sometimes if it's moving really fast and it's a really dark night like this, I'll kick up my ISO, sometimes 3200. I've gone even 6400. I try not to go past that with my camera. It starts getting harder to compensate for and clean it up in post, but typically you can get that high and it'll work. But if this shot was a 6 to 10 second exposure like my average, then it would not be very interesting because you would not have any of this detail. That would all just be smooth. So something to consider there with the aurora. It's a little bit more variable and you kind of have to pay attention to that. If it's not moving, keep your ISO down. If it's fast though, it's worth bringing the ISO up a little bit to have a little bit more room to play with in the shutter to keep it slower or faster. I mean, excuse me. Same thing there. You get so much more detail, so much more interest. And when there is no moon, that's what it's all about, because it's all about the drama anyway. So you want to have that. Here's one super dark night and moving pretty quick, but you know, I could have probably brought that shutter speed down even more. There's a little satellite there. In the northern hemisphere, we get, or well, way up north anyway, we get a lot of satellites all the time. So a lot of these photos are going to have satellites in them. Most of the time I don't worry about them, but sometimes I'll clean them up if they're really obnoxious. Here's one. So you get this pink band. It's reasonably common. This is the color that you're most likely to see with your naked eye. The other colors, the reds and the purples, are really, really rare to see with the naked eye. This pink, this is actually when the energy from the sun actually reaches lower into the atmosphere. So this is kind of that 50, 60 miles above the Earth's surface range. It's penetrated really deep into the atmosphere and actually starts interacting with nitrogen. So that's where you get that pink color from, is the nitrogen gases. The upper atmosphere is almost entirely oxygen, so the green, and the reds, I'll show you that in just a bit. Some of the reds, that's from the oxygen, whether it's molecular or atomic. And here's some star trails. So this was a 30-minute exposure. And if you want to do like real decent looking star trails, I don't recommend anything less than 20 minutes. 20, 30 minutes is kind of a minimum. And then if you want them to go all the way around, it's pretty much an all night sort of show. Typically, if you want to do that, though, it's better to do, put it on like a motor and motor drive, and you can track it or build the star trails in post rather than having a single long exposure image, because an all night image would be pretty muddy with a long exposure noise probably.
So you're not doing that in live mode because your battery will kick out.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
And that one has a little bit more of a moon. So same thing here. This one, there's a lot more moon. So you can see how many stars you lose versus having no moon. There's a little bit of aurora down in that bottom right corner. And then that's a little bit of a moon, but mostly dark. And then this one, there's a fair little moon shining there. So you don't get as many of those stars. But star trails can be fun to play with, or just astrophotography. When there's nothing going on, I'd sometimes just go take pictures of stars. See, here's one that I didn't quite get those stars perfect, which is too bad because it was otherwise kind of cool, but you got to watch it. It's just too easy to bump. Another aspect, you can do comets, or this was actually a meteor from one of the meteor showers. Can't remember which. You can usually tell that it's a meteor because it'll be pinched at both ends and then brightest in the middle, rather than a satellite will be an even line all the way across. And satellites aren't that bright ever. But this one, if you want to get meteors like during a meteor shower, best thing to do is just put it on your tripod and put it on a timer and have it take like as long of an exposure as you can before you get the star trail. So I test the lens and see how long I can go without getting any sort of star trail. So I think in this case, I think I was shooting, it was probably about 15 seconds with this lens. That's average. I've seen some I can get upwards of 20 seconds, but 15 is usually safe. But that gives you the best chance of avoiding or of getting the trails, because you're going to take as many photos as possible and have as little space between them. So if it's doing 15 seconds and then like half a second in between each shot, you're going to get almost the entire night. So if there is ever any meteor that comes through your frame, you should pretty much be able to catch it. This is the only good one. I've caught a couple tiny ones over the years. Little guy there in the middle. And then this tiny little guy there as well. But that first one's my only good one. That one was from an actual meteor shower though. These were all just random. So another thing that a lot of people ask is where to go for the Aurora. If you're from the US, Fairbanks is pretty much the easiest. It's an international airport. It's a big enough city to have lots of hotels, all the infrastructure, the tour companies that make it a pretty easy one to plan. There's lots of places to go. You can get out of the city easily to get away from the city lights. You don't have to go anywhere. You can see the aurora from Fairbanks. You just have to get away from the city lights to photograph and to see it well. So it is very simple. Other really common places, like this one was taken in Iceland. I was there for 5 weeks a couple years ago. I was able to see some, but Iceland, the challenge with that one is that it's so cloudy so often. I got lucky on this night and it was a little bit broken, so I could still see the aurora through it, which I think adds quite a bit of drama and makes it pretty cool, but makes it challenging. I know way more people that have gone to Iceland to try and see the aurora and have failed than have successfully seen the aurora from Iceland. It is beautiful country though, so if you want to go, highly recommend it. But if you're going to go at a time of year where you can see the aurora, just let that be a bonus or icing on the cake rather than the purpose, because I know so many people who missed out on Iceland and how amazing it was because they were so disappointed in not seeing the aurora while they were there. So since I was there for quite a while, I did see several. This was actually a geothermal power plant with the aurora, but I thought it kind of made a pretty cool composition. Aurora over one of the fjords, the aurora and a tiny bit of the Milky Way there again. They don't get a whole lot of it there either. This one is probably one of my favorite aurora experiences though. It's not my most dramatic photo, but this one, having been a guide for so long and always having lots and lots of people and helping lots and lots of people, which I love helping people take photos and everything, but this one was neat because it was just me and the aurora and the ocean for probably 50 miles before there was another person anywhere. It was up in the fjords, in the northwest fjords, and there was just no people because it was off season, so there were no other tourists. There was no one. It was just silent, with just the river meeting the ocean and the ocean meeting the shore and the aurora overhead, and it was magical. So this one was a fun experience, but there was another one from Iceland, just the Milky Way. But I was out photographing the Milky Way when I turned around and found this going on. So I changed my attention, obviously. I was not expecting it that night, but it was pretty neat. Same thing, super dramatic just because there's no other light. And back to Alaska. But that's a common question, so I wanted to include a couple from Iceland just because it is a very, very popular destination for aurora viewing. But other places, Yellowknife is also really popular. It's not one that I super recommend in Canada just because there's very little infrastructure there, so it's harder to find a hotel. It's hard to find transportation. It's hard to find tour guides, and it's very flat, so you don't have much of a foreground, and there's not very many trees, so you can't even work with tree lines really much. So from a photography standpoint, less interesting in my opinion because of that. Norway, I would love to go to Norway. They have a similar problem with the clouds, but the photos that come out of there are just incredible. These ones, and this was a series just showing how quickly and easily it can blow up on you. And if you're not watching or paying attention, because it happens so quickly, you'll blow out your whole photo. So these two are the exact same exposure, but I started blowing it out because the aurora got so bright so fast. And then on another night, it did this on me, almost completely blown out. I was able to compensate for the next shot and get it back where it belonged, but I missed most of those pinks because that pink is so bright. It's so challenging to photograph because it is so incredibly bright and it comes up so quickly that it's hard to adjust your shutter speed fast enough to compensate. So literally this one would have been probably a 6 or 8 second exposure. And this was 2. Usually when it happens like that, I'm shooting down in the 2 to 3 second range. So it's a pretty dramatic decrease. Same thing here, totally blew that one out. But this one was part of a time lapse that I was doing, so I wasn't in control of that one. I was bummed that I missed that one, but it happens. This is what happens when you get that right, and you can get that pink under there, but it's just so incredibly bright that you have to underexpose everything in order to get that to really show up with much clarity and color. And this one was from this past fall, October, just as the lakes were starting to freeze up. Nice calm day. All right, this is the one when you were asking about the detail and the shutter speed and movement in the Aurora. So this was the same night, couple seconds apart. It shifted the composition just a little bit to center that little section of activity there. I had to bump the ISO up to 20,000 in order to get this down to a 2-second exposure because it was so dark that night. And this is one of those cases where the Aurora actually did get brighter. Typically when it's moving faster, it's also brighter. So that helps. You can bring your shutter speed down automatically just because the Aurora is brighter, but it didn't in this case. So I had to use just ISO. And so that one's not really a keeper, but I was curious to see what kind of detail I'd get. And that just kind of gives you an idea of what that can do to you. You get just kind of this blurred out section here versus something that actually has some of the texture and detail to it. Same thing here. This one was zipping so fast, 2-second exposure. This would have all just been one blurry line if it had been the normal 5 to 10 seconds, but you get all of the stripes with it, all of that texture and detail. That one was one of the big ones. This one was almost electric. It was moving so fast and had so much detail in it. That whole night was like that, actually. That was about 3 years ago in March. And that's actually another good question. A lot of people ask, you know, when to come. During the solar equinox during the spring and fall is when the Aurora, the sun actually is most active. So thus the Aurora tends to be most active. If you're in Fairbanks, it doesn't make as much of a difference since they're right underneath the auroral oval. You'll get this sort of thing a lot more often. You'll get some Aurora every night, but what happens is you'll get more of these kind of shows, these kind of incredible, super active, high energy shows more often when the sun is more active. So actually just this past couple of months, the Aurora has been pretty active because we've actually got some sunspots now, which we haven't had for a couple of years, actually. It's been pretty quiet sun. So that's kind of cool for all the Aurora photographers this year. And these are some of those pinks. I think all of this section of photos has some of that color. You'll get the pink back underneath. That's from the nitrogen. And then you'll get the reds and purples up above the green. And when that happens, that's still from the oxygen. But this is molecular oxygen will glow green typically. And then the atomic oxygen will grow red. So those reds that you'll see are still from oxygen. Also, it has to do with the number of atoms in the atmosphere. There's a lot less of them up here, so they can actually energize more before they hit each other. And you'll get that different color just because they're not hitting each other as often up here as they are in the greens because there's a lot more oxygen molecules. Same thing there. You can see a little bit of the pink across the top. Some of these I'll kind of zip through sort of quick, but this one is a little bit different actually. This one's kind of more of a purple rather than a red. In the spring and the fall, the sun is only going down partway, so it gets dark enough to see the aurora and the stars and everything. It gets pretty dark to the naked eye, but the sun is actually still zipping across that upper atmosphere. It's clipping across the top of the atmosphere, and it'll actually interact and create this purple haze. Somewhere in here I've got one where you can see kind of the purples and the reds. That one's really dark. It was faint aurora, but you can still see it. I'll point it out when I get back to it, when I come across it, but yeah, it's in this set. Here we go. Get those purples from the sunlight. And then this one, you can actually, in this corner, you can see the reds. So that's the upper atmosphere oxygen reds. And then that's sunlight skipping across and interacting. But these colors are really hard to see with the naked eye. So almost always the only color we see with the naked eye is the reds, or the greens, excuse me, and then that pink layer underneath. The high level reds and purples and things are really hard to see with the naked eye. This one was bright enough I could actually see a little bit, but it was very faint. I could tell it was there, but the color wasn't very visible to my eyes. Another way that you get a lot of color in the photos besides the Aurora green, one of my favorite things, in Fairbanks, it is so cold and the air is so clear, but the cities will actually put out a lot of water vapor. They just always do. And you'll get just a little bit of a frozen fog over the city sometimes, and that'll reflect the light and you'll get this nice little pink. So it's actually light pollution, but I find it actually interacts really nice with the Aurora, makes for beautiful colors with the Aurora. So a lot of times I actually use that to my advantage to get a little extra color. That one's a good one there. There's actually some clouds mixed in that case, but you'll get some color from light pollution from the cities. That was my cabin. That's where I lived, but it's nice to just walk out the porch and have the Aurora. And this one I don't think would be even an interesting photo if you didn't have the pinks and the greens and the clouds and things. So sometimes those elements that as photographers we tend to think of as being less ideal, the light pollution and things, actually can be a big benefit. So I try not to rule it out. Sometimes I don't like it and then I try and shoot without it, but most of the time actually it works out pretty nice. This one was just a really dark night and really faint Aurora. So I decided to experiment and try just maxing out my exposure and overexposing it essentially. And I ended up getting these really beautiful kind of pastel painterly like colors from overexposing. So this is one of those like almost like daylight, but it has nothing to do with the moon. So I kicked up my ISO, I think I only went to 3200, but this would have been like a 15-second exposure to get those kind of pastel colors. Nice dramatic clouds. Clouds definitely can add some drama to the Aurora, as long as it's not blocking it out completely. These pretty interesting things going on sometimes from the clouds. This is one of those misty nights. There's just a tiny faint mist in the air. It's a little bit warmer. And most of the time I don't like that because it blocks out the stars. But if you get a spot like this where the stars are still nice and clear, you get kind of this faint, hazy sort of look from in the Aurora because of the haze and the fog, which I actually really like. I think it's pretty nice. Same thing there. Reflections in the fall. So like I was saying earlier, if you want reflection photography, you definitely want to come earlier in the year. So usually September through early October is going to be our reflection season. But you get some really neat shots. This is one of the benefits and blessings for me of COVID, because I wasn't working. I was able to go places that I didn't usually get to venture out to and get a little bit more variety of some photos with all the reflections and ponds and things. There's a lot of ponds around Fairbanks. So, and this is one looking almost straight up. So in a super active Aurora, a lot of times it'll be right overhead and you get these. A lot of people refer to it as a CME, coronal mass ejection, which that actually only technically scientifically refers to the energy being released from the sun in a mass ejection. But it will often create these kind of shows. So people have linked them and they call them that as well. So you'll hear that term for those overhead massive auroras. Same thing there, straight overhead. But it is really beautiful. And that's kind of where the term curtain comes from, curtain of light, because it's like if you were laying underneath a curtain and looking straight up through the curtains as they kind of swayed. So you get that term. That's kind of where that visual comes from. just a handful of shots there. Some of the clouds. It's amazing the different patterns and colors and lines and textures that you get from the aurora. It's different literally every night. I've seen hundreds of shows and no one has been like another. They're completely unique, but that's Mother Nature at her finest, I'd say. Does anybody have any questions or anything? I'm just kind of filing through a few of these.
Megan, do you ever do any videos?
I have not done much. So I've done a couple time lapse. I can actually pull those up here in just a minute. But I have not done any live video. My camera is not actually capable of it. Most of the ones that actually do it well are the professional line for the Sony mirrorless cameras, and they do quite well because they perform really well at super high ISO. Because usually live video, even with a full moon, you're talking 28,000 ISO. I mean, kind of crazy sort of numbers, but it definitely can be done. Portraits are kind of fun. You do need a flash though, because otherwise you just end up shadows like that one. I missed the flash, so I became the shadow figure, but you can have a lot of fun with it too because of that. That's my husband there. He gets to be my guinea pig sometimes. Some neighbors down the street. These guys are like pure Alaskan. As Alaskan as it gets. They were awesome. They've lived there their whole lives and never had a photo of themselves with the Auroras. So they came over and I took some for them. Got a great night. Some panoramas. These are harder to do because you can't really do it when the Aurora is moving very fast unless you had, you know, multiple cameras that you could shoot off simultaneously, or just a really wide angle lens that you can crop down. But these were composites, 3 images stitched together on some slower moving auroras, but gives you some pretty fun results because it's so hard to get the whole thing most of the time. Even shooting at 15 millimeters, which is what my lens is, 15 to 30, and most of the time, 90% of the time, I'm full wide, 15 millimeters on a full frame sensor, and I'm still not getting everything. So it's kind of fun to do this. I do have a, what is that one, a 12 millimeter? Is it a 10? Anyway, fisheye, that I can get almost everything, but you get a lot more distortion out of those too. So it's not my favorite. My lens is a Tamron, and I love that lens. It is so heavy, but it is an awesome nighttime lens. Rokinon also makes really, really good lenses for night photography, and they're actually pretty affordable. They're really sharp. They're manual focus only, so that's where some of the softness or the cost savings come from, but that's what you need for night photography anyway, so they're great for this. This particular shot was kind of funny. We find people all the time will rely on their technology to tell them when the aurora is going to come out, and I always tell people, just go out, just be out there. This particular night though was like negative 50 degrees and I was freezing my butt off, and it had just been sitting like this doing almost nothing, and I wanted some nice photos so bad with that beautiful full moon and the clear snow. So I was getting antsy trying to decide if I could afford to go in and warm up for a minute or not. And so I pulled out my phone to see if I could pull up some of the data to decide if I should go in, which is a crapshoot anyway, realistically. But I was looking at my phone and not paying attention to the sky or the camera, and it started doing this. And then it blew up overhead and I completely missed it because I had my nose in my camera trying to decide if I could afford to warm up or not. I managed to get this one shot off, but I missed a really good opportunity because I wasn't just out there and paying attention. The most important thing is to just have your gear ready and just be out there. Otherwise, you're likely to miss it. And I was out there and I still missed it because I had my head in my phone. So technology can be our friend, but it can also be our enemy. So I managed to get a couple shots that night, but I missed some of the better ones. So I was pretty bummed. because it can go so fast. Sometimes the aurora will last like this all night long, and sometimes you only get a couple minutes. That's another one where I knocked it out of focus. This was that same cold night. And so now I've discovered a weakness in my technology. If it's really cold, I can't zoom. I just have to leave it where it's at. But this is why full moon photography in the snow is my favorite for aurora. So you just get these beautiful compositions. Reflections are still fun though.
Megan, do you see any problems with the mirrorless performance in the cold?
Actually, no. The only weakness I've seen, I don't think their batteries last as long, but as long as you have spares, that's not too much of a weakness. But the actual performance of them is actually very well. They take amazing images, and especially those Sony mirrorless, the professional Sony mirrorless, they perform so well at those high ISOs, which gives you a lot more to work with in terms of the live video and other things like that. Because where I'm stuck, I can only do the time lapse. I have done a little bit of it, but that's all I can do. So, but yeah, the point and shoots don't do super well. The cell phones, when it's really cold, especially iPhones, unfortunately, they do really bad. When it's -30, -40 out there, I mean, they're gonna last a couple minutes at best before they die. The cameras do a lot better. Typically, on an average night, I can shoot continuously, like time-lapse style. I can shoot continuously for a couple of hours on a single battery with my Canon. Nikons go through the batteries just a little bit faster, but they still do good. The mirrorless, a little bit faster as well, but not too bad. So if you're shooting with a cell phone, it can be done. I've seen Aurora photos with cell phones and they're getting much better. 5 years ago, when I first started with this, all I did is tell people to put their cameras away, their cell phones away, because they weren't going to do them any good. Same thing with the point and shoots. Now we're getting some of the little cameras that can do a lot more too, but as technology improves. But for the most part, you're still going to be better off with a interchangeable type lens camera in terms of quality and performance in the cold. The biggest deal is just making sure you cover them before you bring them in so that they can warm up slowly, so they don't fog, but you'll get moisture inside the camera when that happens, and you do that repeatedly and it can definitely do some harm to the electronics.
What I was finding, I was up in Seal River, and I found that the display on the back of the camera was just really streaking and slow, even on the 5D.
Yeah, so the LCD display is the biggest weakness. I've actually had mine completely freeze up where the LCD doesn't work at all because of the cold, or it will get streaky. But I've only actually, at least with my Canon, I've only had that happen a handful of times. And it was because it was, those -40s and 50-degree temperatures. Yeah. And I was a crazy one that was out there for an hour or two in it. But that's the only time I've ever really had troubles with that with my Canon. Some of the lower end LCDs, like the intro level mirrorless cameras, those ones I've seen that be more of a problem. But it seems like when they pull the photos up on the computer afterward, the photos are fine. They just can't see them. Typically, that's been my experience anyhow.
Yeah, I got frostbite on the tip of my nose.
I've done that so much. Oh, it's horrible.
Oh, darn.
Yeah, 1 year, what was it, 3 years ago, super, super cold, like every night, and I was out every night. My nose was permanently red. Like I looked like Rudolph that whole winter because I just kept getting frostbite on my poor nose. It was really painful. Now my nose, like the end of my nose, if I go out in the cold, it hurts like almost right away. It's like, nope, I'm not doing this anymore. You've already
Yeah,
abused me
I
too
tried
much.
to look through my viewfinder. That was my mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
it's
instant. Oh,
it's fun. But that's part of the adventure of shooting in the cold. Oh, that does actually remind me. I know one thing you had mentioned that is true with shooting long exposures using either a remote or like a cable release. When it's really cold out, I actually don't recommend cable releases because the cable will freeze solid and people have a tendency to keep holding on to them, and it actually causes movement in the camera, and you'll blur your photos from holding on to your cable release in the cold. And I also don't recommend using the phones in the cold. If your phone like connects to the camera and you can control the camera from your phone, you know, because the phone's battery dies so fast, it doesn't work. And then people have to go back inside and adjust settings, and it's not worth it. So just control it from the camera and keep it as much hands off as possible. But
and the real key, you know, Jan, you had asked about focusing, is although in your mind you're focusing on the stars, you're really focusing on an affinity point, and it can be done during the day. You're not literally, you can make some adjustments, but if you go to do it here on Skyline Drive or something, I just recommend you focus, you get a focus point that's far enough out. It can be 60, 70 feet out, and then just either mark or lock your focus. And, you know, it's almost like, to some extent, the real skill here is the preparation. It's the thinking it through, because then I found it was so dark, you know, I was just doing my exposures and then having to see and adjust. And the other thing that you have to know is with these super wide lenses, you're going to get the trees like in this picture, they're going to point in, because that's the distortion of the lens. And that's why sometimes, and I like to take them vertical, because I get less of that distortion, or some of Megan's reflection ones where they're less pointed up to the sky, because with your wide angle lenses, the more that you rotate and point them, the more you're going to get the bottom sort of distortion. There's just no way around that, given the type of lens that it is. And so, you know, change what you're pointing at and how high or how low, just to see the difference. And the other thing that when Jill asked about how much walking you have to do, sometimes literally it's that people get so hung up with all the steps and thinking it through that, you know, there's a photographer I went with that said, tripods have legs and so do you, you know, just move. And you know, I see that all the time, that it's literally 3 steps one way, 4 steps the other, getting low, getting high. It's that experimentation, particularly if there's not a lot happening, but people tend to get locked into one spot and just fire off all the same picture in that one spot, you know. But if something's happening really quickly, then yeah, you stay. But in between, you start to say, well, if it continues, what can I do? And around here, the night skies are not going to change that much if you're doing star photography. So move around and play with your foreground objects. The same is going to be true when I talk about doing flowers. You know, people tend to snap the flower from one angle and get under it, you know, get to see how's the flower seeing the world. That's what changes, but people do tend to get locked in and not move, particularly in landscapes for some reason.
Yeah, I would see that all the time. And it's so easy with Aurora because the adrenaline is pumping, especially the first time you see it. If you see a big show, a really active show the first time, it's hard to get yourself moving again because there's kind of that just awestruck moment. Yeah. And let yourself have that. Like, I totally recommend it. Like, sometimes my favorite thing is when what's in front of me is so amazing, I just have to put my camera down and experience it. And the Aurora definitely does that sometimes, but it is good to move because you can get multiple different shots on the same night. But you don't have to necessarily hike 10 miles to do it. I've done that. I mean, I've hiked 10 miles for a single photo, but I have also shot, 20 or a portfolio of 20 or 30 good images in the space of 100 yards in any direction too, and you definitely can be done. That partially depends on how active the aurora is and how much it's doing and how it's changing perspective, but you can definitely not have to move a lot, but moving is always a good thing. This one, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It also keeps you from losing the feeling in your feet.
Yes, it does. Helpful. A very, very useful skill in that case. Another thing too to mention, just from a technical standpoint, I left some of the noise in on a couple of these just because this was earlier in the fall when it's not as cold, and so you get that long exposure noise and you get the hot pixels and things like that. I don't usually use the long exposure noise reduction at all with Aurora Photography. A, it's cold enough to not really have to worry about it, but B, it doubles your exposure time, which cuts the number of photos you can take in half. So most of the time I don't worry about it, but like in this case, I probably could have been using it, but it's also not hard to remove in post. I just haven't done it on this particular image, but something to be aware of. But I usually just turn it off on mine.
That's a setting in your camera. There's a setting that says long exposure noise reduction, and by most cameras it's set as on in your default menus when you get them, and I turn it off for that same reason, because I don't want it takes longer. You're going to miss some pictures.
Yeah, exactly. And especially when it's cold, you don't need it at all. Like I never even get hot pixels in the middle of the winter, but earlier in the fall like this, I will. So technically it could do some good, but it's not hard to fix in post, and it does. It cuts the number of photos you can do in half. So it's not worth it, in my opinion. That one I always thought looked like green flame from the trees.
You mentioned you had some time lapses.
Yeah. Let me see. This one's probably one of my best selling photos there. And then I think I've finished off with, yeah, that one that you found on my Facebook page. That one is definitely one of my favorites. Let's see if I can pull up. There we are. Let's see if it'll play. So this is one of the time lapse. So I do these a lot when there's a lot of guests that I need to be working with, but I still want to get photos, so I can kind of set my camera up and then go help people, but still be getting something. Plus time lapse is pretty cool. This one's neat because you can see how bright the aurora gets. You can see how much the foreground changes. That's purely from the aurora light.
Now, is that in real time?
So this would be just a little bit faster than real time. When you stitch a time lapse, it's almost impossible to get it to be live time. So like this one, I think, how long was the space on this one? I think I wrote it down. Or maybe I didn't. No, I didn't write that one down. From the first photo to the last photo time, usually about 30-40 minutes though. Taking, I think this one would have been probably 8-second exposures roughly. And so it's definitely compressed, but it does still display the movement fairly accurately. A little bit faster, but still kind of accurate. This one, I'll just show a little portion of it. This is, the aurora isn't always in bands. After a big show, it'll do what we call a flicker. And this is pretty close to what you're gonna see. It's a little more faint with the naked eye, but that's what it looks like. It's just like pulsating at you. And it's really neat effect and extremely difficult to photograph because I have to shoot less than a second exposures to get this to actually show the movement and the detail. So this one's like 28,000 ISO. So it's a small time lapse only. You're not going to print any of these photos, but it does show you some of the cool different things that the aurora will do. Afterward, there's just so much energy in the atmosphere that the whole sky is full of it. But it's not coalesced into a kind of a single area. So all the energy is spread out. So it's not as bright to our eyes, but it does really, really cool things. And I left this on for like 3 hours for that time lapse. It was pretty cool. On this one, I just pulled up a couple of them, but this one was from a nice night. I started a little late. I like with time lapse to be able to start before it really builds, so you can kind of get that build up, and then as it comes back down as well, calms back down. But you can see the swirling in it. That's what I like about this one, is it just kind of swirling around itself. But it's a fascinating phenomenon, and it's definitely one of those life-changing kind of events. So if you haven't seen it, which I'm assuming probably most of you, if not all of you, have not, it is worth whatever you have to do. It is worth seeing. It's life-changing.
Questions, comments?
Nada?
I have a question about your hands. What kind of gloves do you use?
So what I actually have are, I'll use just a really thin wool liner, something that I can manipulate the camera with. And then I actually have heavy flannel lined wool gloves that are like the fingerless mitts, but they have, you know, the part that folds over the fingers. So in between, while it's taking a photo, I cover my hands back up. But when I need to actually manipulate my camera, I have my fingers so that I can actually manipulate the camera. But you still have to have some sort of a layer, because that camera is as cold as it is outside. So if it's -50, so is my camera, and you will get contact frostbite. So you got to have some coverage.
The other thing sometimes that I use is I have a hunting muff, and even the other day when I was walking, when it was snowing, because I tend to have thin gloves to manipulate my camera, and then I have the muff, and also in the muff I can keep hand warmers and the batteries.
Mm-hmm.
I always try to keep your spare batteries as close to your body or your hand warmers as possible.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to go really high end, there's the Heat Company gloves that Chaz Glazier now is selling, and those are pretty good. Even his liners are pretty good, but the hands are always a problem. You have to be cautious of your fingers, because I tend to want to feel and manipulate things. The other thing that I've done is, those little furniture pads that the little felt pads, I've put them on my shutter and my back buttons that I need, so that I can feel them through the gloves a little bit. At -40, particularly if you're doing wildlife and having to do more manipulation, it's those really do help. You could just stick them on, and that way, as your fingers feel less, you can at least manipulate your shutter. I mean, when we were in Canada at Seal River doing polar bears, we never brought our cameras in. They stayed in a foyer that was not heated. And what we did is when we come back from shooting, we had cubbies for our cameras. We pulled our cards and our batteries and brought them in. But if we had brought them in, the difference, just having the cameras acclimate, it would have been a real problem. So it was nice to be able to leave them outside. You can bring them in if you wrap them, but you've got to be really, really careful with them. I had a camera get damaged bringing it in, even though I wrapped it. So even today, the difference when I came in today, it was 20 out. I left my camera and my lens in the garage for about 30 minutes before I brought it in the house, because I just didn't want it to mist up. And the same can happen in the humidity. Like if you're in Costa Rica or southern Texas and air conditioning and you have your cameras inside, Before we shoot, we bring them outside. It's still in their bags with the lens covers on, let them acclimate, because the difference in temperature can really affect the cameras. So
What do you think your go-to settings are for Aurora photography?
Go-to, basically my starting point on any shoot is typically going to be 1600 ISO, and then wide open, which most of my lenses, I've got one that's wider, but 2.8, and then depending on how much of a moon or snow there is, usually 6 to 13 seconds. If there's no moon and there's no light pollution and there's no clouds, it is gonna be super dark. And even with that ISO and even with the wide open aperture, you're still going to be looking at that 13-15 second range pretty easily. Sometimes it's been dark enough I've actually had to bump the ISO up to keep from getting star trails. But most of the time, you know, 1600 is pretty good. If I need to bring that shutter speed down for a faster Aurora, then I'll kick up the ISO so I can get that shutter speed down. But like I said, a lot of times when the Aurora gets faster, it also gets brighter. So you can automatically bring that shutter speed down a couple seconds just because you've got more light to work with. So.
Other questions, comments? Is everybody ready to go to Alaska or Iceland or Lofton, Norway?
I was there a couple years ago, and I had gone into those forecasts of where the Aurora was supposed to be, and I was only like in Haines, so I was not very far north, and it was too far north as far as what they were suggesting that week's forecast, so didn't see it.
The other thing that Megan said that I think is really 2 points I really want to reinforce. One is if you go someplace, go for multiple days, because the first time, whether it's a phenomenon like the Aurora or whether it's seeing a polar bear or a grizzly bear, multiple days, like the first time you experience it, you're going to be so excited. There's a lot of adrenaline, and once you get to the routine and get adjusted to how to photograph, and you have a chance to go in and look at your images and say, tomorrow I would do XYZ, it really does make a big difference. And I've had some lucky trips and I've had some unlucky trips, and even in the unlucky trips, I went for polar bears. It was -40. We had a mom and a cub one day for 30 minutes, but the Arctic fox were wonderful and the environment was beautiful. And so we did what we could. But, if that had been the first time for me to see polar bears, would I have been really disappointed? Yes. But that's why I tend to say, this is something that's really important to me, and I'm going to do it multiple times. The first time I would go somewhere, I'd say it's a trip of a lifetime. But, the place where I met Megan, I'm going back for the third time there because, sure, I could go other places, but I look at my images and I now know those particular families of bears, and I just want to follow them. I want to see them again. And you're so much better the next time. You're not having to take 150 pictures. You can also sit and watch and really enjoy it. And so I really do recommend, as you start to make decisions about what you want to photograph, being able to pick places and go. And then if something doesn't happen, just be delighted in what's there, because these are beautiful places. And people do get really disappointed. As a guide, Megan has to deal with the fact that this is nature and people can get disappointed. And I think a lot of it too, I was on one trip and we had 3 days of miserable weather, and the group was so positive. And then for the next 6 days, we had incredible, we had spirit bears coming out of everywhere, not orcas, but humpbacks, breaching. But if we had gone negative, I think the whole time it would have been just a miserable experience. So that's part of wildlife photography, is know that, you know, nothing's guaranteed. And do plan your trips to spend the time, so that if you get something, that's great. And if not, you have more time, and put your cameras down sometimes. You know, it's okay to do that.
Quick point too, kind of along those lines. Typically, I recommend, like, you know, 5 to 7 days for Aurora if you can, because it is so unpredictable. I know it's been mentioned about the forecasts, and the forecasts are getting better, but our knowledge of Aurora is so young. It is such new science for us that we're just learning a lot of this stuff. And that forecast, take it with a huge grain of salt, because I have sat out on nights with a 5, 6 forecast. It goes up to a 9, and you rarely see anything higher than a 6. And I would sit out there all night long and watch nothing but stars, because it just doesn't happen, because there's so many other aspects going on. The only thing we can really predict and base those predictions on are the sun's activity, because it's fairly cyclical, fairly predictable, but there's so many other factors that change constantly that they can't really predict or factor in yet, that you never really know. Because I've been out, that photo actually that you pulled for your presentation, that was taken on a 2 forecast, which is pretty much as low as you'll ever see in Fairbanks, is a 2. And that entire night was blowing up, and it shouldn't have been anything according to the forecast, but maybe a minimal little band with no major activity. So the more days you have, the more you can afford to take, the better your chances are going to be, especially with weather too. You throw in weather as yet another factor, and it's hard. But you know, 7 days is pretty good odds if you put yourself in the right place, especially Fairbanks. It's usually pretty clear there, so the weather's not as big a factor, but it still plays in for sure. And there's lots to do, lots to see. So, you know, let yourself have fun and take advantage of everything else. You know, I've spent many a night photographing moon dogs, because that's all there was, or, you know, whatever. But I always find something. It's Mother Nature, and she's pretty fascinating. But, or light painting, you know, you just bring out the flashlights and start doing some light painting. You know, you never know. But definitely give yourself some time. And if you plan it ahead of time, if you're able to kind of book things sort of last minute, there are ways that you can increase your odds, because like I was saying, the sun is relatively cyclical, so it'll get these peaks, these highs in activity, usually every 2 weeks, roughly. There'll be a high, and in between it'll just kind of be, you know, a little bit of whatever, but you'll get 3 to 5 days of good activity during those peaks, and they're predictable. So you see photos come online from last night's great shows, and you look at the forecast, and like the next several days are good on the forecast. Then you go, okay, so 28 days, 28 days, 28 days, you know, you can kind of calculate that out and kind of center your trip on those days, and it will increase your odds. Still not guaranteed, but it does help. So there are ways, but don't put too much emphasis on that forecast. You spend your whole time looking at that phone and all the data, and you miss the shots, you know, it stinks, but it happens to the best of us too.
Thank you so much. It's great seeing you again.
I just wanted to say, Megan and Sharon, thank you so much for what a wonderful presentation. Looking at the photos and just all the information was just wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thanks, Sharon, for inviting me. It's a lot of fun. I haven't been able to really rub shoulders with fellow people who have similar interests with COVID and everything. I haven't had my guiding time for a while, so it's kind of nice to see some other faces and enjoy.
Picture your photos were fantastic.